quite an exciting day, isn't it? And a conference yesterday, I heard such wonderful speeches and talks. And so I'm going to kick off talking about my play, Rites of Passage. So as a playwright and an actress, I've always enjoyed working with debate and theatre. In this case, as we understand it, where the script is based entirely on interviews with people about a particular subject or theme, usually of a political or social nature, as we addressed just before lunch. I love hearing people's stories, and I particularly love hearing LGBT people's stories. And for various theatre and film and oral history projects that I have worked on over many years, I've now had the pleasure of interviewing probably something like 150 people, LGBT people, about their lives and experiences. And one of my plays, Rites of Passage, is based on interviews with lesbian and gay asylum seekers in the UK. And it also includes interview extracts from a few people who work in that area. So in 2016, with support from Arts Council England, the play toured to 12 theatres around the country, around England that is, over a 6-week period, and I acted in it alongside 3 members of my own theatre company, Artemis. Rites of Passage shares the experience of those who, in fear of their lives, come to the UK from anti-gay countries, and then either apply for asylum when they arrive here, or sometimes live undocumented and often penniless existences, in many cases for years, before they finally have the courage or even the knowledge of how to apply to the Home Office for asylum based on their sexual orientation. And it's really synchronistically wonderful, isn't it, that in a way this topic leaves off from where the previous discussion of deportation where we left, and we carry on talking about asylum seekers. As a playwright who has worked on several theatre projects addressing LGBT issues, and as an LGBT activist who I'm directly involved either as a patron or a trustee for several LGBT and human rights organisations, I had for a long time been interested in LGBT rights in different countries around the world. Homosexuality is illegal in 69 countries and in 41 out of the 53 Commonwealth countries. The UK has threatened to cut or retarget aid to countries which continue to persecute the gay community, but the Commonwealth countries which continue to do so are opposed to any change on religious and nationalist grounds. So over the 5-year period that I researched and then produced this play, I became personally acquainted with several members of LGBTQ asylum groups and organisations. This occurred mainly through attending protests and demonstrations which highlighted LGBT human rights abuses, or were supporting individual asylum seekers who faced imminent deportation. And most of these actions were organised by the London-based LGBT asylum group Out and Proud. I gave talks about my theatre and activist work to some of the asylum groups, one of these being at a meeting of Rainbows Across Borders, who are based in Croydon, and another for the UK Lesbian, Gay and Immigration Group, Gay and Lesbian Immigration Group. And I also, liaising with Oxford House in Bethnal Green, I offered free writing workshops for all asylum seekers and refugees. I did that a couple of times, and the workshops were called Writing the Journey. At several theatres where we later performed this show, we invited members of LGBTQ asylum seeker groups to the show, and we paid for their tickets. Because as you probably know nowadays, you can't actually just let whoever you want into a professional theatre. You actually have to, because the theatre company want to make, the bookers of the theatre need to make their money. So if you want contributors to come to a theatre show that's in a theatre, you actually have to, I would say, budget for or raise that money separately. Just a sort of extra point about this kind of work. And at the end of the play, myself and the cast held Q&A sessions so that these group members, as well as other audience members, could talk about the play's content and share their reactions to the production. So I did such a sort of huge range of interviews to start with, and having said that, I was really, really worried that at a certain point I would not use people's interviews. So I had to be very clear that, you know, this is just for the research period, and this is another thing that comes up when you're specifically focusing on verbatim theatre productions. But I did a sort of research period for myself in a way where I was just interviewing lots of people I found interesting, not asylum seekers, but about, so I could learn about LGBTQ rights and oppression in different countries around the world. As the research developed, I became particularly interested in the stories of three contributors who I'd met and interviewed. Marimba was a lesbian from Uganda, Izzadin, a gay man from Malaysia, and Hamid, a gay man from Iran. And the play ended up focusing on their stories, describing their experiences in their countries of origin through to what happened when they came to the UK and since that time. And I wanted the play to concentrate on the contributors' journeys, which of course did not end once they arrived in the UK, but are ongoing and emotional as well as geographical. So the first act of the play was staged primarily in their varying countries of origin, showing incidences of persecution that had led the three main characters to seek a safer life in another country. And the second act mainly focused on their encounters within the asylum system in the UK. And by the end of the play, the audience had learned that 2 out of 3 of them had successfully attained refugee status, but one, Marimba, was still awaiting the outcome of her asylum application. So in the play, we first meet Marimba in Uganda, where she falls in love with a woman at her university, has a secret relationship with her, but after completing her degree, she's then forced by her family into a marriage with an extremely abusive man. A few years later, she comes over to London to visit her brother, who is studying here, and I think I prefer the lights on.
Oh, sorry, Claire, I just
Yeah.
thought the picture wasn't very clear.
No, you're absolutely right, but I don't have that many pictures, so
Okay.
I think for me to see the
So
words,
sorry.
it's probably more important. Thank you. No, it's a good thought. But I know what you're doing. Thank you.
Best of intentions.
So she's at university, she has an affair, she comes back to her family and her village, and basically her parents force her into a marriage with a very abusive man. A few years later, she comes over to London, Marimba does, to visit her brother who's studying here. And this is an excerpt from the interview used in the play where her brother was showing Marimba the sights. So this is from Marimba's speech. I remember one day as we were walking around, we saw 2 women kissing. I was shocked, I was. It was bad for me to stand there and look at them, but they were kissing. And then my brother turns around and says, why are you standing there? And I said, can you see them? Who, he says, those 2 women kissing, is that allowed? This is something that I'm seeing for the first time, and something that shocks me. Something I didn't know that does happen, that 2 women can kiss in public like straight people. So I say, won't they be attacked? Won't they be beaten? Isn't it risky for them? My brother says, oh, no. He says, you know, this country allows it and some stupid people do it. In my country, it is illegal to be lesbian or gay. They will kill you. Even if the government changes, the family, the community, those people, they can kill your life. You know the tires, car tires? That's what they can burn you with. They put them on top of you and they set fire to them. That's the torture, the worst torture. They will do it if they want to kill you. They talk like being a lesbian is something you choose to do. That's why they force marriage. That's why the police will rape you. They say to make you straight. Even the communities will rape you to make you straight. And no one will blame them. They say that you are the evil one. You are the bad one. You are the one who is bringing bad things to the family. You are bringing shame. So up until it was suspended in 2015 and deemed illegal by the High Court, there existed an asylum-seeking procedure, which I'm sure some of you will have come across, called the Detained fast-track system, which was a process where asylum seekers whose claims were not held to be credible by the authorities were detained immediately after their interview and given a period of 2 weeks to appeal, often without access to legal help. On admission to the detention centres, their own phones were confiscated. They were given phones to use, but they contained none of their own personal contact information, making it almost impossible to gain legal support in time for them to make a successful appeal. After the fortnight elapsed, if their appeal was refused, they were forcibly boarded on a plane and returned to their country of origin, where, upon their return, their lives were then under even greater threat. Another thing I learned was how some LGBT people on arrival in the UK, usually on short-term holiday visas, like Marimba, when they decide to stay here, they're often unable to find people from their country of origin to help and support them. The people they might meet from these countries, in particular African countries, are usually as homophobic as those from whom they have fled. And another area where the safety of LGBT people is seriously compromised is when they are held in detention centres in the UK, where they are under threat of assault by other detainees on account of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And this occurs because many people in the countries, in the centres, both staff and inmates, are as strongly homophobic as those in the countries of origin that the LGBT asylum seekers were fleeing. One of the contributors to the play that I played myself was a woman called Erin Power, who was the director of the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group. So this is from one of her speeches in the play. She explains, if you leave your country, you leave behind everyone who knows you. No one even knew you were homosexual in your own country. Then you come here, you have to prove it. I mean, how are you going to prove it? And ultimately, you can't. People get up in arms, I've got to prove I'm gay. Yeah, you have to prove your particular religion or a particular ethnicity that's being persecuted. But if you are a particular ethnicity, other people are that, and they support you in your home country and in this country. You come here, there's a whole community of you here, people that are prepared to say to the Home Office, yes, this person is. So you've got witnesses. But when you're LGBT, you have no witnesses. Often you don't leave until the 1 or 2 people that were your witnesses are dead. So that is the case for a lot of people. So to gain asylum in a foreign country, you do not just have to be fleeing persecution, you have to prove that you are. The asylum system is weighted against applicants, with border agencies generally looking for reasons to refuse rather than to accept refugees, which is reflected in a culture of disbelief in the asylum-seeking process. People claiming asylum on account of their sexual orientation are further disadvantaged, as Erin explained, because they rarely have witnesses to support their claims. They're also in the position of having to prove an identity relating to sexual feelings and emotional attraction towards the same sex, rather than one supportable by documentary evidence. In order to stand any chance of achieving a place of safety, these applicants are forced to talk in detail and openly about something that they've probably previously always kept secret, for which they may not even have the vocabulary. Moreover, they are judged by Western standards on their appearance and the performativity of their sexual orientation, and by criteria such as a previous marriage and having had children, with an affirmative response potentially putting their lives at risk. A further complication is that in some countries there are no actual words that are the equivalent in English of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, other than words used as insults. And one more difficulty, though it is less spoken about, is that Home Office interviewers, translators, and people within the judicial system can sometimes be homophobic themselves, which can affect the result of their decision. So in an asylum interview situation where the pressure is immense and the choice of words spoken by the claimant, often in their second language, is so critical, there are many possibilities for miscommunications in a system that is set up to seek reasons not to grant asylum rather than to help those trying to escape persecution. This next excerpt from the play demonstrates one such example. So this is Hamid, the Iranian contributor, from a little scene in the play where I was playing an interviewer. So Hamid says, in my interview, the Home Office woman, she asked me, have you a boyfriend? Are you in a relationship with a man now? So I said, no, not in the UK. The Home Office woman, she then says, so did you have a boyfriend in Iran? And Hamid replies, and I wanted to say that I had a boyfriend, but I thought if I say, okay, I had a boyfriend, I had sex with him, they will say to me, you're saying that you had sex with your boyfriend, that you had a relationship in Iran. So if you did that, then you weren't in danger. So why are you here claiming asylum? So instead, I said, no, I don't have any boyfriend in Iran. I hadn't any sex or relationship, but I am gay. Then she said, so can you tell me where G-A-Y late is? What? G-A-Y late, where is it? I don't understand. Well, you say that you lived in London when you first came here, so surely you know where the gay clubs are and what time they close. I only lived in London for 3 weeks. So you can't tell me where G-A-Y late is. No, I didn't go out to a club, and then I was put in jail. Now I know that after 12 o'clock, G-A-Y, it's closed, and after the G-A-Y, it's G-A-Y late. You can stay there from 12 to 3 o'clock, and after that, 3 to 5 o'clock, heaven is still open. But I'd only been here for 3 weeks, so for that they said, you are not gay. Okay, fair enough, thank you. Thank you for telling me I am not gay. Fleeing from imminent persecution in Iran for being gay, Hamid came to the UK to seek asylum, but he was finally granted it a few years ago, but only after being incarcerated in a jail here, then spending quite a lot of time in a detention centre, and then making several court appearances at different courts around the country. He told me, however, he was delighted to be a contributor to the play, and he joined the panel in the Q&A session that we had after the first rehearsed play reading, which was at Oxford House as part of the R&D process. He was also excited to hear that the play has now been published as a script, because he said he hoped it would reach a wider audience that way and inform people about the punitive laws in Iran about homosexuality. And, in order just to touch briefly on that subject, the legal implications of those laws, I interviewed an amazing woman who was a human rights lawyer, Iranian woman, called Mary Jafari, and I played her as well in the play. So this is one of her excerpts. I practiced law in Iran for 5 years. Now I live in England, but I don't think I can go back to Iran because I talk publicly about the political situation with women's rights, human rights, LGBT rights. I was the only lawyer in Iran defending LGBT rights openly. And I had a problem with the government because I had to report some cases, very dangerous situations, to international organizations. For example, there were 20 people under execution threat for being gay. They'd been at a party, a gay party, but Besiji, that's the social police, they actually go inside the party and arrest people. And we had cases of men in jail who had 3, sometimes 4 days without water or food, hitting, threat of torture. And when they are under this pressure, they sometimes get scared, they confess, they say, yeah, I'm gay. and after a confession, it's very difficult to help them. But under Islamic law, being gay does not mean that you are a criminal. But as soon as someone acts upon it and enters into haram relationship, which means prohibited relationship, they will be treated as a criminal and they will be under threat of the death penalty. In Iran, it's not being gay, it's the act that's criminal. So the more I heard about treatment of LGBT asylum seekers and personally came to know people who were suffering as a consequence of seemingly rushed and often random UK border agency and Home Office procedures, the more it seemed that these practices amounted to violations of basic human rights. LGBT people who had travelled to the UK to seek protection were being criminalised, subjected to personally intrusive and sexually explicit questioning procedures, imprisoned, and then sometimes, after all that, deported. As a verbatim theatre practitioner, I wanted to create a play based on the testimonies of people who had undergone these harrowing experiences. I was aware that such stories held powerful staging possibilities, but my main motivation in the creation of a script based on these issues was to inform a wider public by means of a theatre production and national tour about what I considered to be a seriously underreported issue that showed the UK's immigration system, as well as our country's commitment to the 1951 Refugee Convention, in an extremely bad light. Verbatim theatre seemed to me to provide a powerful means to convey personal testimony and political information addressing this important subject. So, armed with an understanding of what most LGBT asylum seekers experience in the process of their application, the theatre practitioner who seeks their stories for dramatic use cannot be unaware of the ethical minefield they enter, most particularly because an interview by a playwright has the potential to repeat or at least resemble the asylum interview procedure. The Canadian theatre practitioner and scholar Julie Salverson warns us that thoughtlessly soliciting autobiography may reproduce a form of cultural colonialism that is at the very least voyeuristic. And Alison Jeffers, who's another marvellous theatre scholar and practitioner, also identifies concerns about the creation of asylum and refugee-focused plays. She suggests that the playwright may deliberately seek out and select for the final script what she calls narratives of persecution. And I'm aware that sometimes as I was listening to people during their interviews on hearing about a particularly harrowing incident or experience, I often found myself thinking, oh my God, what a terrible thing to have happened to them. But actually that would make a really good scene. So narratives of persecution are sought by the UK Border Agency and the Home Office in the stories provided by asylum seekers. And similar narratives were sought by me as a playwright looking for dramatically moving and even shocking incidents from the contributors' lives. But the main difference in these processes is that for the Home Office, a claimant has to prove their sexual orientation and prove the level of persecution and trauma they would suffer if they were returned to their country of origin. Therefore, for lesbian and gay asylum seekers, the focus of the asylum interview is on convincing others of their sexual orientation and the veracity of their accounts. However, in an interview for a play, the same kind of stories they share are ultimately employed to engage, educate, and inform a wider public about matters relating to lesbian and gay asylum seekers. And therefore, one of the main differences between these similar situations lies in the purpose of the interview. Although it is important for theatre makers to identify our own agenda and our motives in the creation of this kind of work, we must remember that often the contributors themselves have a strong reason for wanting to participate in verbatim theatre processes. In a post-production interview I conducted with Marimba, asking her about her involvement and about the reasons she agreed to be interviewed, she gave me some interesting answers. I just want to say at this point that what I've been doing, and not really for research or academic purposes, is when I can, I've been interviewing contributors after the whole production has finished. Because my particular interest, or at least academically, but also personally, is on the experience of the contributor through the dramatic process, seeing and then eventually seeing themselves acted on stage by an actress. Obviously there's other forms of verbatim theatre where sometimes the people actually play themselves, but I'm talking about when they are played by an actress. So part of that interest had led me to specifically interview people a few weeks after the production or even a couple of years later and say, what was your experience of being involved in that show? And asking questions which I didn't ask at the time, but I'm really interested to find out now and collate that research. So when I interviewed Marimba, I asked her, one of the questions was about the reasons she agreed to be interviewed. And she said, I wanted my story to be heard because I knew I'm not the only one that has gone through such hardships. And coming from Africa, when you're there, no one hears you or understands you. So now I've got the opportunity of saying it, and knowing you write plays and that other people are going to see that play, and then they will tell another person about the play, and probably when the script comes out, another person will read that script, and probably they will do something about it. Then I can make a difference, and maybe my story, one day, one time, it will save somebody else. So one of the practices encouraged by feminist oral historians in the late 1970s in any research that involves interviewing, and that includes sociology and anthropology as well as oral history, is that interviewers must employ what they call critical reflexivity in their work. My own understanding is that part of the process involves identifying the positionality of the playwright, and by that term I mean the position of the interviewer in relation to the person being interviewed, who in this talk I'm calling the contributor, since this can have a significant impact upon the contributor's experience. My own opinion is that in spite of the fact that dangers of re-traumatization exist when an asylum seeker narrates stories of persecution to a playwright, whether that be from recalling the original incidents or from their experience of being interrogated by the Home Office officials, it is possible that these risks can be mitigated when the interviewer and the narrator share some degree of lived experience. Marimba actually told me that it was because I was a lesbian that she had agreed to come forward to be interviewed. She said, with you, I thought, oh, she's a lesbian and she'll understand what I'm about. She'll really get my point. Because straight people don't really get it when I say it wasn't easy what I went through, because they're not in my shoes. In interviews with lesbian and gay contributors for verbatim theatre work, it would be hard to claim definitively that the level of disclosure can be greater on account of a shared sexual orientation than it might be with a heterosexual interviewer. But it could well be the case that a joint understanding of experiences of prejudice and marginalisation in society would increase the level of trust the interviewee feels towards the playwright. Although I certainly did not have shared experiences of the kind of prejudice the contributors had suffered in their countries of origin, it's my understanding that talking in depth to an attentive and caring listener, as I hope I was, about horrendous incidents which relate to our shared sexual orientation provided an opportunity for contributors to narrate and compose their memories in a safe situation where they would not be judged. Informed consent is a critical part of both oral history practice and, I believe, verbatim theatre processes, especially with LGBT asylum seekers, since it enables contributors to fully understand the implications of their participation in the production. And with the contributors to rites of passage, I would clearly outline how I intended to use their stories with their full permission in a forthcoming script, and I would send them excerpts from their interviews that I wanted to use in the final script before that final script was completed and we went into rehearsing for their approval. So in the creation of a play about homophobia, when the theatre makers, in the case of my play, both myself, the writer, and the actors themselves, and the contributors, share the same sexual orientation, I'm of the opinion that there was an enhanced level of trust in the project and sense of safety in the interview situation. But clearly, when there is a racial difference between the contributors and the playwright, shared sexual orientation must not be conflated with shared experience. So another practice encouraged by feminist oral historians is that of reciprocity. And I suggest that this concept can inform and enhance verbatim theatre processes. In the field of oral history, many discussions have taken place over the last 2 or 3 decades about potential benefits that narrators might attain in return for their invaluable stories, which contribute to other people's research projects and frequently advance the careers and reputations of those conducting the research, or in our case, the directors, the playwrights, the artistic directors, the programmers. Currently, in some instances, people who agree to be interviewed are paid a small stipend either for filling in surveys or for being interviewed in an oral history project. However, this is very rare, as far as I know, in verbatim theatre work. But perhaps it is timely to reassess this matter. Other than paying contributors for their interview time and content, I believe it's quite reasonable to ask theatre companies, as I mentioned before, to budget in their funding proposals for travel expenses for the contributors to come to the shows or to take part in post-show discussions, and always to offer free tickets to the performances. Additionally, theatre companies could seek ways to support any groups or organisations which have provided contributors or who work in areas that the subject matter of the play addresses. And that just might depend on looking at forms of giving in kind to an organisation rather than financial contributions. So, to wind up, verbatim theatre, at its finest, creates a powerful, direct, challenging and moving means of dramatising personal narratives in a way that brings home to an audience the experiences of those whose lives have been less documented. And although Rites of Passage was one of the most challenging pieces I've ever worked on, due in part to the difficulties in finding contributors from niche groups, but also with regard to issues of trust, discretion, and ethics that gathering such material involves, it also has proved to be one of the most exciting and important projects that I've ever had the pleasure of working on. So I'm going to end by returning to the moving and powerful words of Erin Power, the director of the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, who believes that for most people, seeking asylum is not seen as a permanent step of moving across the world to take root in another country, but a temporary one, made usually to escape unbearable persecution and danger. So this is Erin again. I believe that the people we work with, the people that get out, are the privileged, and that we should remain conscious that we are only ever working with privileged people, either educationally, financially, or politically. Not that they in any way feel privileged. But we do have to acknowledge that it's only a certain group of people that are ever going to be able to escape. And some people are never going to get away, particularly poor women. All our clients want to go home. None of them wants to stay here for the rest of their lives. They will, some of them, because it may not be in their lives that things change enough. But I can imagine some of our clients being 80 or 90, going back to Uganda. Yes, I can imagine that. Thanks for listening.